January 31, 1942, Wichita, Kansas. A 26-year-old defense worker named James G. Thompson sat at his kitchen table, pen trembling slightly in his hand, composing a letter that would ignite a movement. Outside his window, America was mobilizing for total war. Factories roared to life. Young men lined up at recruitment centers. Victory gardens sprouted in every yard. The nation spoke with one voice about defeating tyranny abroad. But Thompson's hand shook not from fear of the enemy overseas. It shook from the weight of a question that burned in the hearts of millions of African Americans across the nation. Should I sacrifice my life to live half American? He addressed his letter to the Pittsburgh Courier, the most widely read black newspaper in America. His words were simple, direct, and devastating in their clarity. Thompson wrote about the contradiction that defined black existence in wartime America. The paradox of fighting for freedoms they themselves did not possess. He proposed something unprecedented, a double victory, 2 V's. The first V for victory over the Axis powers from without, the second V for victory over racism and discrimination from within. The Pittsburgh Courier published Thompson's letter on that January day, and within weeks, it had become a rallying cry that would echo from Harlem to Los Angeles, from sharecropper shacks in Mississippi to factory floors in Detroit. The Double V campaign was born, not from politicians or generals, but from the heart of a working man who dared to name the unspoken truth. This is the story of that campaign, but more than that, it is the story of the 1 million African American men and women who wore the uniform during World War II, who fought on 2 fronts simultaneously, one against fascism in Europe and the Pacific, another against Jim Crow at home. It is the story of how they transformed American society through their sacrifice, their courage, and their unwavering insistence that freedom be made real for all. The roots of the Double V campaign reach back to a betrayal that still scarred black memory in 1942. A generation earlier, during the First World War, black leaders had urged their people to close ranks with white America, to prove their loyalty and patriotism by serving without complaint. Over 380,000 African Americans had answered that call, with more than half serving in France. They had fought with distinction. French commanders had praised their valor. Some had returned home wearing the Croix de Guerre, France's highest military honor. Their reward was the Red Summer of 1919. From April through October of that year, white mobs launched attacks on black communities across America in at least 25 cities. In Chicago, Washington, Omaha, and dozens of smaller towns, returning black veterans, some still in uniform, were beaten, lynched, and murdered by white Americans who saw their service not as patriotism, but as uppity insolence. The message was brutally clear. No amount of sacrifice would earn black Americans the rights they sought. 23 years later, as another world war erupted, black Americans remembered. They would serve again. Patriotism and hope spring eternal. But this time, they would not be silent. This time, they would fight for victory at home, with the same determination they brought to victory abroad. The military they joined in 1941 and 1942 was a rigidly segregated institution that reflected and enforced every racist assumption of American society. Black soldiers trained in separate units, ate in separate mess halls, used separate latrines. They were commanded almost exclusively by white officers, who often viewed them with contempt. The Navy relegated black sailors to mess duty and labor battalions. The Marines refused to accept black recruits at all until 1942, and even then, only under intense pressure from civil rights organizations and Eleanor Roosevelt. The official position of the U.S. military was that black soldiers were inherently inferior fighters, less intelligent, less courageous, less capable of the initiative required in modern warfare. This pseudo-scientific racism was codified in policy documents and training manuals. Black units were often assigned to service roles, loading ammunition, driving trucks, building roads, burying the dead. When they were assigned to combat units, they were typically given obsolete equipment and substandard training. The irony escaped no one. America was fighting a war against Nazi Germany's doctrine of Aryan supremacy, while enforcing its own doctrine of white supremacy at home. The hypocrisy was so glaring that German propaganda exploited it relentlessly. Radio broadcasts aimed at black troops asked why they were fighting for a country that denied them basic human rights. Leaflets dropped on black units pointed out that they were fighting to preserve a system that oppressed them. Black soldiers didn't need German propaganda to see the contradiction. They lived it every day. At military bases throughout the South, black soldiers in uniform were forced to give up their seats on buses to German prisoners of war. They could not eat in the same restaurants as enemy combatants. When violence erupted between black soldiers and local whites, which happened with alarming frequency, military police consistently sided with the civilians. The Lee Street riot in Alexandria, Louisiana, on January 10, 1942, exemplified the volatility of this situation. It began when a white military police officer assaulted a black soldier accused of harassing a white woman. A crowd gathered. Police began shooting indiscriminately into the mass of black soldiers and civilians. When the smoke cleared, between 10 and 15 people lay dead, with dozens more wounded. The incident was barely reported in the white press, but in black newspapers, it became a symbol of the dual threat black soldiers faced: death from the enemy abroad, death from their own countrymen at home. Into this toxic atmosphere came the WWII campaign, arriving at precisely the moment when Black America needed a unifying vision. The Pittsburgh Courier, under editor Robert Vann, embraced Thompson's letter with the fervor of prophetic revelation. Within days, the newspaper had designed a double V logo, two Vs, one superimposed upon the other. They printed buttons, posters, and bumper stickers. They ran surveys to gauge reader support. The response was overwhelming. 88% of readers endorsed the campaign. The double V became ubiquitous in Black America. Churches held double V rallies. Black colleges organized double V clubs. Workers wore double V pins to their factory jobs. The campaign provided a framework for articulating what Black Americans had always known, but often struggled to express, in a way that white America couldn't dismiss: that their fight for freedom was inseparable from America's fight for freedom. The Roosevelt administration watched the campaign with deep unease. President Franklin D. Roosevelt himself wrote to Robert Vann, requesting that the newspaper tone down its rhetoric about racial discrimination. The Federal Bureau of Investigation began monitoring black newspapers, looking for signs of disloyalty or sedition. J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director, was convinced that civil rights activism was a cover for communist subversion. Special agents infiltrated black organizations, compiled lists of suspicious individuals, and reported back on any rhetoric that questioned American racial policies. By 1943, under pressure from the government and amid concerns about national unity during wartime, the Pittsburgh Courier began to soften the campaign's more confrontational edges. The double V logo disappeared from the paper's masthead. The focus shifted from demanding immediate change to celebrating incremental victories. But the genie could not be returned to the bottle. The campaign had awakened a consciousness that would not be put back to sleep. For while the campaign itself faded from the headlines, the men and women it inspired were just beginning their fight. They were training at segregated bases from Texas to Massachusetts. They were boarding ships bound for Europe and the Pacific. And they were determined to prove, not just to white America, but to themselves and to history, that they were the equals of any soldier who ever wore the uniform. The Tuskegee Airmen became the WWII campaign's most celebrated warriors, at a time when military officials and much of white America insisted that black men lacked the intelligence and reflexes to fly complex aircraft. These men proved otherwise with a vengeance. The program began at Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama, chosen precisely because it was in the heart of the segregated South, ensuring that black aviators would remain isolated from white pilots. Between 1941 and 1946, approximately 992 pilots graduated from the program. They formed the 99th Fighter Squadron, and later the 332nd Fighter Group, along with several bomber squadrons that never saw combat before the war's end. Their training was harder than that given to white pilots. their equipment was often older. Their white instructors frequently doubted they would succeed. Captain Benjamin O. Davis Jr., who would lead the 99th and later the 332nd, remembered the atmosphere. We were expected to fail. Every mistake was scrutinized as evidence of racial inferiority. Every success was dismissed as an anomaly. But they didn't fail. In April 1943, the 99th Fighter Squadron deployed to North Africa, flying P-40 Warhawks in support of Allied ground operations. Their first aerial victories came in January 1944, when they shot down 6 German Focke-Wulf 190s in a single day, a remarkable feat given that their opponents were flying superior aircraft. The man leading that mission, Major George Roberts, proved that black pilots could not only fly, but could outfight the Luftwaffe's best. When the 332nd Fighter Group arrived in Italy in 1944, equipped first with P-47 Thunderbolts and later with P-51 Mustangs, they began flying bomber escort missions deep into Germany. They painted the tails of their aircraft distinctive red, earning them the nickname Red Tails, or Red Tail Angels. Bomber crews, initially skeptical of their black escorts, quickly learned to request the Tuskegee Airmen specifically. While the myth that they never lost a bomber is not entirely accurate, they lost 25 bombers to enemy fire over 179 escort missions. Their record was exceptional compared to other fighter groups. Between 1943 and 1945, the Tuskegee Airmen flew more than 15 Zallos and sorties. They destroyed 111 German aircraft in aerial combat and another 150 on the ground. They decimated ground targets, 950 rail cars, trucks and other vehicles, bridges, radar installations, and supply depots. They sank 1 German destroyer using only machine gun fire, a feat so improbable that it made headlines when Lieutenant Wendell Prout and Lieutenant Gwyn Pearson accomplished it on June 25. On March 24, 1945, they flew what would become their most celebrated mission. 43 P-51 Mustangs, led by Colonel Davis, escorted B-17 bombers on a 1,600-mile round trip mission to Berlin. En route, they encountered German Me-262 jets, the world's first operational jet fighters. Faster than anything the Allies possessed, the Tuskegee Airmen shot down 3 of the jets, proving that skill and determination could overcome technological disadvantage. For this action, the 332nd Fighter Group received a Distinguished Unit Citation. The cost was substantial. 66 Tuskegee Airmen were killed in action. 32 were shot down and became prisoners of war. 12 died in training accidents. Each loss was felt acutely in the tight-knit community of black aviators and in black communities across America. These were not just soldiers. They were symbols of possibility, proof that black excellence could not be denied even when it wore a uniform. Back home, their achievements reverberated through black America. Young people, who had been told they were inherently inferior, now had irrefutable evidence otherwise. Parents pointed to the Tuskegee Airmen when their children asked whether they could achieve great things. And white Americans, if they were honest, had to confront the fact that the black pilots they'd dismissed as incapable had proven themselves among the war's finest. While the Tuskegee Airmen commanded the skies, another group of black warriors was writing its own legend in blood and steel across the battlefields of Europe. The 761st Tank Battalion, the Black Panthers, became the first African-American armored unit to see combat, and they would compile a record that forced even their skeptics to acknowledge their valor. Formed in April 1942 at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, the 761st trained for nearly 2.5 years before seeing action. This extended training period was not a gift. It reflected the military's reluctance to commit black tankers to combat. Senior commanders simply did not believe black soldiers had the technical skill to operate and maintain the complex FM-4 Sherman tanks that formed the backbone of American armored forces. Lieutenant Colonel Paul L. Bates, the battalion's white commanding officer, disagreed. He pushed his men relentlessly, held them to the highest standards, and fought constantly with higher command to get his unit into combat. He also stood up for his men against Southern racism. When the legendary baseball player Jackie Robinson, then a lieutenant in the 761st, was court-martialed for refusing to move to the back of a segregated bus in July 1944, Bates refused to prosecute him. Robinson was transferred to another unit and eventually acquitted, but he never made it to Europe with the Black Panthers. The 761st landed in France in October 1944 and was assigned to General George S. Patton's Third Army. Patton, known for his profanity-laced speeches and aggressive tactics, was also a product of his era's racial prejudices. But he gave the Black Panthers a chance, and they seized it. Legend holds that Patton addressed them before their first combat operation, saying, "Men, you're the first Negro tankers to ever fight in the American Army. I would never have asked for you if you weren't good. I have nothing but the best in my army. I don't care what color you are as long as you go up there and kill those Kraut sons of bitches." Whether Patton actually said those exact words remains debated among historians. What's undeniable is what happened next. On November 7, 1944, the 761st attacked the German-held town of Morville, Les Vic. Lieutenant Colonel Bates had been wounded the night before, and the assault was led by Captain John D. Long, a black officer from Detroit. Sergeant Roy King's tank led the way into the town and was immediately hit by a German Panzerfaust. King and his crew kept fighting. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers performed an act of extraordinary courage, leaping from his tank under heavy fire to clear a roadblock. Then, driving his tank to pull the obstacle away, opening the road for the rest of the column. The Black Panthers captured Morville, Les Vic after fierce house-to-house fighting, but the victory came at a cost. King would later be killed in action. Rivers, wounded in the leg by German artillery 3 days after his heroic action, refused evacuation and continued to fight. On November 19, his tank was destroyed by German anti-tank fire. Rivers died at his post. 52 years later, in 1997, President Bill Clinton posthumously awarded Rivers the Medal of Honor. The 761st fought continuously for 183 days, a record that exceeded the combat endurance of most American units. They participated in 4 major Allied campaigns across 6 countries: France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Germany, and Austria. They fought in the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive, helping to break the encirclement of American forces at Bastogne. They helped breach the Siegfried Line, Germany's defensive fortifications. In April 1945, they were among the first American units to link up with Soviet forces at Steyr, Austria, effectively cutting the German army in two. By war's end, the Black Panthers had inflicted an estimated 130,000 casualties on German forces. They had destroyed thousands of German vehicles and pieces of equipment. Their casualty rate approached 50%. 391 men received decorations for heroism, including 7 Silver Stars, 56 Bronze Stars, and 246 Purple Hearts. 3 officers and 31 enlisted men had been killed in action. 22 officers and 180 enlisted men had been wounded. Yet when they returned home in 1946, there were no ticker-tape parades for the Black Panthers. Many returned to a South where wearing their uniforms in public risked provoking white violence. The Presidential Unit citation that recognized their extraordinary service was not awarded until 1978, 33 years after the war ended. The Medal of Honor for Reuben Rivers came 52 years late. America preferred to forget that black tankers had helped save it. But the men of the 761st remembered. They had proven something fundamental, that courage knows no color, that competence is not determined by race. That black Americans would fight and die for their country, even when their country denied them equality. They had lived the double V in the most visceral way possible, fighting for freedom abroad while their own freedom remained incomplete at home. Not all of the 1 million African Americans who served wore combat uniforms or flew fighters or drove tanks. Many served in roles that military planners considered appropriate for black soldiers: transportation, construction, stevedoring. These service units have often been dismissed as less important than combat troops. The Port Chicago disaster revealed the deadly lie in that assumption. Port Chicago, California, was a naval ammunition depot located about 30 miles northeast of San Francisco, established in 1942 to handle the massive shipments of ordnance needed for the Pacific Campaign. It employed hundreds of sailors, virtually all of them black enlisted men, overseen by white officers. The work was brutally dangerous, Sailors loaded bombs, artillery shells, depth charges, and other munitions onto cargo ships bound for the Pacific. Each bomb weighed 300, 600, or even 2,000 pounds. Some were fitted with detonators. The incendiary bombs were notoriously unstable. Yet the black sailors received virtually no training in munitions handling. Their officers, mostly reservists with no experience in ordnance, provided no meaningful safety instruction. Instead, they turned munitions loading into a competition, posting daily tonnage figures for each division on a blackboard and encouraging the men to work faster, to compete for the highest numbers. The Longshoremen's Union, observing this recklessness, warned that a catastrophe was imminent. The sailors themselves repeatedly requested better training and safer procedures. They were told to work faster. On the evening of July 17, 1944, 2 ships were being loaded simultaneously at Port Chicago's pier, the SSEA Bryan and the SS Quinault Victory. The Bryan's holds were packed with 4 606 tons of high explosives and incendiary bombs. 16 rail cars on the pier held another 429 tons of ammunition. Working through the night shift were 320 sailors and civilian workers. At 10:18 p.m., without warning, the world exploded. Witnesses 30 miles away saw a brilliant white flash followed by an enormous orange mushroom cloud. The blast, equivalent to 5,000 tons of TNT, registered as a 3.4 magnitude earthquake. The SSEA Bryan was simply obliterated, not sunk but atomized, transformed in a microsecond from a 10,000-ton ship into fragments scattered across miles. The Quinault Victory was blown 500 feet into the bay. The pier ceased to exist. The rail cars and locomotives vanished. Buildings a mile away had their windows shattered. The shockwave was felt 430 miles away in Boulder City, Nevada. 320 men died instantly. 2/3 of them, 22, were African American sailors. Another 390 people were injured. Only 51 bodies remained intact enough for identification. For days afterward, search parties found pieces of human remains scattered across the landscape. Survivors described the smell of burning flesh that hung in the air for weeks. Freddie Meeks, a black sailor who survived the blast, spent the next days putting body parts into baskets. He described it decades later as the moment his innocence died, when he truly understood that his life, his black life, was considered expendable by the Navy that enlisted him. 3 weeks after the disaster, the survivors were ordered to return to work, loading ammunition at the nearby Mare Island facility. Nothing had changed. There was still no training. The same white officers who had encouraged unsafe competition were still in command. The risk of another explosion remained as high as ever. 258 black sailors refused the order. They didn't mutiny in the traditional sense. There was no violence, no threat of violence, no attempt to seize control. They simply said, "Not without training, not under these conditions." The Navy, faced with what it perceived as mass insubordination during wartime, came down with brutal force. After threats from Admiral Carleton H. Wright, 208 of the sailors agreed to return to work. They received bad conduct discharges and forfeit of 3 months' pay. The remaining 50, forever known as the Port Chicago 50, were charged with mutiny, a crime punishable by death in wartime. The court-martial that followed was a travesty of justice that shocked even observers accustomed to Jim Crow's legal system. The defendants had no adequate legal representation. The proceedings were rushed. The verdict was predetermined. On October 24, 1944, all 50 men were found guilty of mutiny. They received sentences ranging from 8 to 15 years of hard labor, along with dishonorable discharges. Thurgood Marshall, then chief counsel for the NAACP, attended the trial and later wrote a blistering report detailing its racial injustice. The Port Chicago 50, he argued, had done nothing more than request the same safety protections that white sailors received as a matter of course. They had not mutinied. They had simply refused to be treated as expendable laborers. The case attracted national attention. Eleanor Roosevelt advocated for the men. Civil rights organizations rallied to their cause. By January 1946, 47 of the 50 had been released. The remaining 3 served additional months. But the damage to their lives was done. They carried dishonorable discharges that would haunt them for decades. limiting their employment opportunities and denying them veterans' benefits. In July 2024, 80 years after the disaster, the Navy finally exonerated all 256 sailors who had been punished. Secretary of the Navy, Carlos del Toro, acknowledged what should have been obvious from the beginning. These men had been victims of a racist system that valued their labor, but not their lives. The Port Chicago disaster and its aftermath represented the WWII campaign in its starkest form. These sailors had been serving their country, doing work essential to the war effort. They had asked for nothing unreasonable, just training and safety. The Navy's response was to punish them for refusing to die under preventable circumstances. Yet from that injustice came progress. The Port Chicago case helped accelerate the Navy's move toward desegregation, which began in 1945. 3 years before President Truman's Executive Order 9981 desegregated the entire military. The combat exploits of the Tuskegee Airmen and the 761st Tank Battalion captured headlines. But the 92nd Infantry Division, known as the Buffalo Soldiers, carried the burden of being one of only 2 all-black combat divisions in the U.S. Army during World War II. Their story exemplifies both the heroism of African American soldiers and the ways that institutional racism sabotaged their efforts. The 92nd landed in North Africa in the summer of 1943 and participated in the invasion of Italy in September. They fought their way up the Italian peninsula in a campaign that devolved into brutal, grinding combat through mountainous terrain and heavily fortified German positions. The fighting at places like the Gothic Line and the Serchio River Valley demanded everything soldiers could give. Among the division's members was 1st Lieutenant Vernon Baker, a young officer from Wyoming who had joined the Army in 1941, after being initially turned away by a recruiter who told him, "We don't have any quotas for you people." Baker persisted, enlisted, and earned his commission through officer candidate school. One of the very few black officers in the Army. On April 5, 1945, Baker's company attacked Castle Agonolfi, a German stronghold in the mountains near Viareggio. The castle sat atop steep terrain, protected by machine gun nests, observation posts, and interconnected bunkers. Previous attacks had failed with heavy casualties. Baker led his weapons platoon at the head of the assault. Within hours, he had personally destroyed 3 machine gun positions, killing 9 German soldiers. He destroyed 2 observation posts. He eliminated 2 bunkers. He severed the telephone lines connecting the German positions. When his company commander was killed and 2/3 of the company had become casualties. Baker led the survivors in a fighting retreat, personally covering their withdrawal. His fellow soldiers immediately recommended Baker for the Medal of Honor. Instead, he received the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest decoration. The Medal of Honor, it seemed, was reserved for white soldiers only. Between August 1904 and May 1945, the 92nd Infantry Division suffered approximately 5,000 casualties, a staggering number that reflected the intensity of the Italian campaign. Yet their accomplishments were often downplayed or ignored. White officers blamed failures on the supposed inadequacy of black soldiers rather than on poor leadership, inadequate support, or the simple fact that they were fighting a determined enemy in some of Europe's most difficult terrain. The 92nd produced numerous heroes. 1st Lieutenant John R. Fox, an artillery forward observer, found his position surrounded by German forces during the Christmas 1944 battle at Samokolonia. As German troops overran the town, Fox called in artillery fire on his own position, knowing it would kill him, but believing it necessary to stop the enemy advance. He died in the barrage, but the German attack was halted. Private George Watson, a member of the 29th Quartermaster Regiment, was aboard a transport ship in the Pacific when it was struck by Japanese bombers in March 1943. Watson helped soldiers into lifeboats, then swam through shark-infested waters pulling injured men to safety. He continued until exhaustion overwhelmed him, and he drowned. Staff Sergeant Edward A. Carter Judah, serving with the 56th Armored Infantry Battalion, led a patrol through German lines in March 1945. Though wounded 5 times, including being shot in the left arm, left leg, and left side, Carter continued fighting, killing 6 German soldiers and capturing 2 others who provided valuable intelligence. Private Willie F. James G. Nuhr, of the 413th Infantry Regiment, fought off a German counterattack in April 1945 while wounded and under intense fire. He held his position until he was killed by a German hand grenade, but his actions allowed his company to complete its mission. These men, Baker, Fox, Watson, Carter, James, and Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers of the 761st Tank Battalion, received the Distinguished Service Cross during the war. But it wasn't until 1993 that the Army commissioned a study to determine whether racial discrimination had affected Medal of Honor awards during World War II. The answer was unequivocal yes. In 1997, President Bill Clinton awarded the Medal of Honor to these 7 men. 6 received their medals posthumously. Only Vernon Baker was still alive to accept his award personally, 52 years after the actions for which it was granted. He was 77 years old. When asked how he felt about receiving the honor so late, Baker's response was simple and devastating. "If I was worthy of receiving the Medal of Honor in 1945, I should have received it then." The WWII campaign was not only fought by men. Black women served in critical roles, though their contributions have been even more overlooked than those of black male soldiers. Approximately 4,000 black women served in the Women's Army Corps, WWIIs, and hundreds more served as nurses with the Army Nurse Corps. They faced the double discrimination of racism and sexism, yet they persevered. The first black WWIIs graduated in 1942, but they were immediately assigned to segregated units and given menial tasks that wasted their abilities. Black nurses faced similar treatment. Despite chronic shortages of medical personnel, the Army refused to fully utilize black nurses until 1945, and even then, only under pressure from civil rights organizations. Mabel Storpers, head of the National Association of Colored Graduate Nurses, waged a tireless campaign to end discrimination in nursing, finally achieving integration of the Army Nurse Corps in 1945. On the home front, black women worked in defense industries, though they faced discrimination in hiring and were often relegated to the most dangerous or unpleasant jobs. The iconic Rosie the Riveter image rarely included black women, even though hundreds of thousands of them worked in aircraft factories, shipyards, and munitions plants. Their labor was essential to victory, but their sacrifices went largely unrecognized. The war years also saw the largest internal migration in American history, as millions of African Americans moved from the rural South to industrial cities in the North and West seeking defense jobs. This great migration transformed American demographics and laid the groundwork for the civil rights movement that would explode in the 1950s and 1960s. Black communities in cities like Detroit, Chicago, Los Angeles, and Oakland grew exponentially. These communities would become centers of activism in the post-war years. Yet, even as black Americans contributed to the war effort in unprecedented numbers, racial violence at home intensified. The summer of 1943 saw race riots in Los Angeles, Detroit, Beaumont, and Harlem. In Detroit, 34 people died in a 3-day riot sparked by competition for jobs and housing. In each case, the pattern was the same: white resistance to black advancement, white violence against black communities, and government forces that either stood aside or actively participated in the violence against black citizens. The contradiction could not have been starker. The black soldiers and defense workers were helping defeat Nazi racism abroad while experiencing American racism at home. The WWII campaign gave them a framework for articulating this contradiction and for demanding change. May 8, 1945, victory in Europe. Americans celebrated in the streets. In Harlem and Chicago's South Side, in Detroit's Black Bottom and Los Angeles's Central Avenue, African Americans celebrated too. But their celebrations were tempered by a question: what would this victory mean for them? For many black veterans, the return home was bittersweet at best, traumatic at worst. Isaac Woodard, a black Army sergeant, was attacked and blinded by police in South Carolina in February 1946, just hours after being honorably discharged. His crime: talking back to a bus driver. The white police chief who blinded him was acquitted by an all-white jury after 15 minutes of deliberation. Woodard's case was not unique. Across the South, black veterans were targeted for violence, lynched for wearing their uniforms, or for displaying the uppity attitude that military service had supposedly given them. The message was clear: the war had changed nothing. Black veterans, no matter their service, remained second-class citizens. Except the war had changed everything. It had changed the veterans themselves. They had seen other countries where they were treated as equals. They had proven their competence in the most demanding circumstances imaginable. They had fought for democracy abroad, and they refused to accept its denial at home any longer. On July 26, 1948, President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981, officially desegregating the U.S. Armed Forces. The order declared that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services, without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. Implementation would take years. The Army resisted fully integrating until the Korean War forced the issue. But the principle was established. The order was a direct result of the WWII campaign and the service of black Americans during World War II. Truman himself acknowledged the role that black veterans' advocacy had played in his decision. A. Philip Randolph, the labor leader who had threatened a march on Washington in 1941 to protest discrimination in defense industries, threatened another march to protest continued segregation in the military. Faced with that prospect, during an election year, Truman acted, but Executive Order 9981 was only the beginning. The black veterans who returned from World War II became the shock troops of the civil rights movement. Medgar Evers, who served in the army in Europe and helped liberate concentration camps, became the NAACP's first field secretary in Mississippi before being assassinated in 1963. Hosea Williams, who fought in the Battle of the Bulge and was wounded in action, became a key organizer in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Amzie Moore, another Army veteran, helped organize the Freedom Summer voter registration drive in Mississippi. These veterans brought military discipline and organizational skills to the civil rights movement. They had faced death overseas and refused to be intimidated by the Klan at home. They understood tactics and strategy. They were accustomed to working in teams toward a common goal. The movement that would ultimately destroy Jim Crow was, in significant part, built and led by the veterans of World War II, who had fought for the WWII. The Tuskegee Airmen's success paved the way for full integration of military aviation. By the Korean War, black pilots flew in integrated squadrons. Benjamin O. Davis Jr., who had commanded the 332nd Fighter Group, became the Air Force's first black general officer. His father, Benjamin O. Davis Sr., had become the Army's first black general in 1940, but had spent his career navigating a segregated system that limited his influence. His son would help dismantle that system. The 761st Tank Battalion's heroism demonstrated that black soldiers could perform the most technically complex military tasks. The mythology that black soldiers lacked the intelligence or initiative for mechanized warfare died in the streets of French towns and on German roads where the Black Panthers had fought. The Port Chicago disaster and the subsequent mutiny trial exposed the brutal reality of discrimination in the military and accelerated the Navy's desegregation. The Navy, which had been the most resistant to integrating its forces, began opening all ratings to black sailors in 1945 and moved toward full integration faster than the Army. The WWII campaign itself, though it faded from the headlines by 1943, had planted seeds that would bear fruit for decades. It established the principle that patriotic service did not require accepting second-class citizenship. It linked the fight against fascism abroad to the fight against racism at home, making that connection explicit and unarguable. It demonstrated that black Americans could organize mass movements to demand their rights. The symbolism of two V's, two victories, proved prophetic. The first V over the Axis powers came in 1945. The second V over Jim Crow would take longer. The Brown v. Board of Education decision came in 1954. The Civil Rights Act passed in 1964. The Voting Rights Act followed in 1965. Each of these victories had roots in the WWII campaign and in the service of African Americans during World War II. Vernon Baker, the last living Black Medal of Honor recipient from World War II, lived until 2010. He spent his final decades as a powerful speaker, educator, and advocate. He visited schools, telling young people about the war and about the fight for equality. He refused to let the sacrifices of his generation be forgotten. When he died at age 90, he was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. His Medal of Honor and Distinguished Service Cross displayed on his uniform. The Pittsburgh Courier, which had launched the WWII campaign, continued publishing until 1966, when it merged with another black newspaper. Robert Vann, the editor who had championed the campaign, died in 1940. Before seeing the movement, he helped inspire bear full fruit. But his legacy lived on, in every integrated classroom, every mixed race military unit, every black face in positions of authority that had once been closed to African Americans. James G. Thompson, the defense worker whose letter started it all, remained largely unknown outside of black history circles. He didn't become famous. He didn't lead marches or give speeches. He simply wrote a letter that articulated what millions of black Americans felt in their hearts. Sometimes that's how history is made, not through grand gestures, but through ordinary people finding the courage to speak truth. The 1 million African Americans who served in World War II, the soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Coast Guardsmen, came home to a country that was not yet ready to honor their service fully. Many faced discrimination, violence, and denial of the benefits white veterans received through the GI Bill. Banks refused them mortgages. Universities turned them away. Employers rejected their applications. But they persevered. They used their GI Bill benefits where they could, attending historically black colleges and universities in record numbers. They bought homes in the growing black suburbs. They started businesses. They raised families. They organized. They marched. They sat in at lunch counters and rode freedom buses and registered voters in the face of terrorist violence. And they told their stories. In living rooms and church basements, at family gatherings and community events, they shared what they had done during the war. They made sure their children knew that black Americans had fought for this country, had bled for it, had died for it. They made sure the next generation understood that freedom had to be fought for, that rights were not given but taken. The WWII campaign did not achieve its immediate goals. Jim Crow survived the war intact. Segregation remained the law of the land in the South and the de facto reality in much of the North. Lynching continued. Discrimination persisted. But the campaign set in motion forces that would ultimately prevail. It helped create a generation of activists who would not accept, wait, or not yet, or in due time, as answers to their demands for justice. It provided a moral framework. If we fought for freedom abroad, we deserve freedom at home, that proved impossible to refute. It demonstrated that black Americans could mobilize en masse when given leadership and vision. The veterans of World War II would live to see much of what they fought for realized. They saw schools integrate and voting rights protected. They saw black Americans elected to Congress and appointed to the Supreme Court. They saw barriers fall in employment, housing, and education. They saw a black man elected president, something that would have seemed impossible in 1945. Not all the victories they sought have been achieved. Racism persists, inequality remains, the fight continues, but the WWII campaign and the service of African Americans in World War II established beyond question that black Americans had earned, through blood and sacrifice, their place as full citizens of this republic. In military cemeteries across America and Europe, white headstones mark the graves of the men who fought for the WWII. At the Port Chicago Naval Magazine National Memorial, on the site where 202 black sailors died, visitors stand where the pier once stood and remember. At the Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site, young people learn about the Red Tails who proved that black excellence could not be denied. In museums and memorial halls, the story is preserved and told. But the truest memorial to the WWII campaign exists not in marble or bronze, but in the freedoms that black Americans secured through their struggle. It exists in every integrated military unit, where soldiers of all races serve side by side. It exists in the opportunities available to Black Americans that were closed to their grandparents. It exists in the continuing fight for equality and justice. The men and women who fought for the WWII understood something fundamental, that patriotism sometimes requires criticizing your country, that loving America means demanding that it live up to its ideals, that true loyalty involves fighting to make your nation better. They fought on two fronts, against tyranny abroad and racism at home. They won both wars, though one took longer than the other. They proved that Black Americans were first-class soldiers, first-class citizens, first-class Americans. They refused to accept second-class status, and in refusing, they changed their country forever. James G. Thompson's question, "Should I sacrifice my life to live half American?" received its answer not in words, but in actions. The answer was that Black Americans would not sacrifice to remain half American. They would sacrifice to become fully American. They would fight not just for victory abroad, but for victory at home. They would demand both V's, and eventually, at tremendous cost, after decades of struggle, they would achieve both. If this story moved you, if it made you remember the names that time tried to erase, subscribe and help us keep their legacy alive. The WWII warriors fought for a world where their children and grandchildren would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. That fight is not finished. But, because of them, because of their courage in war and their determination in peace, it is a fight that can be won. Their story is America's story. Their struggle is America's struggle. Their victory, still unfolding, still incomplete, still demanding our commitment, is America's victory. Remember them, honor them, continue their fight.